The test begins. It was a cold, gray morning in Los Angeles. The streets were busy with people rushing to work, cars pushing through traffic, and the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Among the noise and the crowd, a man walked slowly, his shoulders bent, his beard untrimmed, his clothes torn and dusty. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another homeless man struggling to survive another day. What no one knew was that beneath the disguise was one of the most loved actors in the world. It was Keanu Reeves. Keanu had been thinking for weeks about this experiment. He had read countless stories about how homeless people were ignored, mistreated, and often abused by those who were supposed to protect them. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. He wanted to know if the people who wore the badge, the ones who promised to serve and protect, truly showed respect to the people who had lost everything. He knew it would be dangerous. He knew it could go wrong, but his heart told him that truth only comes when you step into the shoes of the forgotten. The disguise was complete. His hair was covered with a dirty hood, his shoes were broken and mismatched, and in his hand he carried a small paper bag that looked empty, but inside was a hidden camera. Every step he took felt heavy. The pavement was rough under his worn-out soles, and the air smelled of smoke and gasoline. People passed him without a glance. Some looked at him with disgust, some with pity, but most did not look at all. It was like he did not exist. The first test came sooner than he expected. At the corner of the street, two police officers stood talking near their car. Keanu dragged his feet closer, pretending to be weak and hungry. He leaned against the wall and asked softly, almost whispering, "Can you help me, sir? Just a little water, please." One officer turned, his eyes sharp, and the look he gave was cold enough to freeze. The other officer shrugged and said, "Move along. We're not here to feed beggars." Keanu felt the sting of those words. He lowered his head and shuffled away, but inside his chest a fire was starting. Was this what people without homes faced every single day? He walked farther, into a part of the city where the sidewalks were cracked and graffiti covered the walls. He saw another man sitting with a sign that read, "Hungry, please help." Keanu sat beside him, and the man gave a tired smile. "Rough day?" the man asked. Keanu nodded. "Always rough," he answered. The man reached into his bag and pulled out half of a sandwich, offering it to Keanu without hesitation. Keanu froze. Here was someone with nothing, yet he was willing to share what little he had. It cut deep into his heart. He took the sandwich with both hands and whispered, "Thank you, brother." In that moment, he realized that kindness often comes from those who have suffered the most. The hours passed, and Keanu saw both sides of humanity. He saw people cross the street just to avoid him. He heard a group of teenagers laugh and throw a bottle in his direction, calling him names. But he also saw a woman bend down, hand him a bottle of water, and smile warmly before walking away. He felt invisible and yet exposed at the same time. Every cruel glance was like a knife. Every act of kindness was like a drop of sunlight breaking through clouds. As evening came, the real test arrived. Keanu sat near a convenience store, his back against the wall, when a police patrol stopped in front of him. The officer stepped out, tall and firm, his voice sharp. "You can't stay here," he barked. Keanu kept his head low and replied gently, "I'm just resting, sir. I'll move soon." The officer did not listen. He pushed Keanu's shoulder hard against the wall. People walked by, staring but saying nothing. Keanu felt the roughness of the concrete scrape his skin, but he stayed silent. His heart was pounding, not from fear of being hurt, but from sadness. Sadness that power could be used this way against someone who had already lost so much. But then something unexpected happened. Another officer, younger and softer in his eyes, stepped in. "That's enough," he said firmly to his partner. He bent down to Keanu and asked, "Are you okay, sir?" Do you need help? Keanu looked up slowly, his eyes meeting the officer's. In that instant, he saw honesty. He saw respect, and it shook him deeply. Here was proof that not all protectors had lost their humanity. The young officer reached into his pocket and placed a few dollars in Keanu's hand. "Get yourself some food, please," he said, his voice kind. Keanu nodded, his throat tight, unable to speak. As the night grew colder, Keanu walked away with tears burning in his eyes. He had started this journey to test the police, to see the truth hidden behind the uniform. What he found was not simple. There was cruelty, yes, but there was also kindness. There was darkness, but there was also light. The streets had shown him a picture of humanity painted with both shadows and hope. He knew this was only the beginning. He knew the deeper he went, the more painful the lessons would become. But he also knew he could not stop now, because behind every disguise, behind every broken soul on the street, there was a story that deserved to be seen. And so, Keanu pulled his hood tighter, took a deep breath, and stepped further into the night, ready for what tomorrow would bring. Deeper into the shadows, the next morning came slowly. The sky was pale, and the streets were still damp from the light rain that had fallen during the night. Keanu had barely slept. He had chosen a hidden corner near an abandoned building to rest, using only a piece of cardboard beneath him. The cold concrete had pressed into his bones, and every sound of footsteps or sirens had kept him half awake. For the first time in many years, he felt a taste of what it meant to live without safety, without comfort, without even a door to close at night. When he finally rose, his back ached and his body felt heavy, but he reminded himself that this was not about him. This was about stepping into the shoes of the forgotten. As he walked through the city with tired steps, he noticed the way people looked at him. Not as Keanu Reeves, the actor loved around the world, but as someone to avoid. A woman clutched her purse tighter as she passed. A man crossed the street even though there was no reason. Every look reminded him how quickly society can erase someone just because of how they appear. And deep inside, he felt both sadness and anger. Sadness because he knew many innocent people lived this reality every day. Anger because he realized how easy it was for those with comfort to look away. His plan for the second day was simple, but dangerous. He wanted to push further, to test not just how police acted, but also how ordinary people responded when a homeless man asked for help. He approached a busy cafe. People sat at small tables, sipping coffee, tapping on their phones, talking about work and life. Keanu walked slowly to the door and held out his hand. "Excuse me," he said softly. "Could you spare a little food? Just something small." Most people pretended not to hear. Some frowned and shook their heads. But one young woman with bright eyes and tired clothes paused. She reached into her bag and pulled out a muffin wrapped in paper. She handed it to him with a gentle smile. "Take care of yourself," she whispered. Keanu felt his throat tighten. Such a small act, but it carried the weight of hope. He bowed his head and said, "Thank you." As the day grew warmer, Keanu wandered into a park where other homeless people gathered. Some were sleeping on benches. Others sat in groups, talking in low voices. He sat beside an older man whose beard was long and gray. The man introduced himself as Frank. His voice was raspy, but there was kindness in his eyes. Frank spoke about how he had once been a teacher, how he had lost his job after an illness, how the bills piled up until his home was gone. "People think we're here because we're lazy," Frank said bitterly. "But most of us had lives, families, dreams. One wrong turn, one bad break, and it all falls apart." Keanu listened in silence, his heart heavy. He realized that every face on the street carried a story, a history that the world had chosen to forget. Suddenly, 2 police officers approached the group. Their footsteps were heavy, their presence sharp. One officer shouted, "You can't sit here! This isn't your living room. The homeless men and women began to move nervously, some gathering their few belongings. Keanu stayed seated, watching carefully. One officer glared at him and said, "Get moving, or you'll spend the night in a cell." Keanu lowered his head and stood slowly. He wanted to see what would happen if he spoke back, so he whispered, "We're just resting, sir. We're not hurting anyone." The officer's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, his hand brushing the baton on his belt. "Are you talking back to me?" His voice was low, threatening. Keanu felt his heart race. He knew if he pushed further, things could get violent. Before the moment exploded, Frank stepped in. "It's all right, officer," he said, raising his hands. "We're leaving." The officer sneered but walked away with his partner. Keanu looked at Frank, surprised. "Why did you stop me?" Frank sighed deeply. "Because it's not worth it. Out here, respect is something we give to survive, even when we don't get it back. If you stand too tall, they'll break you down." Those words pierced Keanu's soul. He realized that the homeless lived under constant fear, not just of hunger and cold, but of power used without compassion. Later in the afternoon, something happened that Keanu would never forget. He was sitting on the sidewalk, his hood pulled low, when a small boy approached him. The boy was no older than 10, holding his mother's hand. He looked up at Keanu and whispered to his mother, "Why is that man sitting on the ground?" The mother bent down and said softly, "Because sometimes life is hard, but we must never forget to be kind." She pulled a sandwich from her bag and handed it to Keanu. The boy smiled shyly and waved before walking away. Keanu sat frozen, holding the sandwich in his hands. His eyes burned with tears he could no longer hide. It was not the food that touched him. It was the lesson. Kindness is something children can carry naturally, but the world too often teaches them to forget. As the sun began to set, Keanu returned to the hidden corner where he had slept the night before. The city lights flickered on, and the streets filled with shadows. He leaned against the cold wall and thought about everything he had seen: cruelty, kindness, fear, and hope, all mixed together. The police who pushed him without care, the woman who shared a muffin, the boy who waved with innocent compassion. The streets were like a mirror showing both the ugliness and the beauty of humanity. And in that mirror, Keanu saw something he had not expected. He saw his own reflection, stripped of fame, stripped of wealth, stripped of everything, except the simple truth that every person, no matter how broken, deserves respect. That night, as he closed his eyes on the hard concrete, he whispered to himself, "This is only the beginning. Tomorrow will go deeper. Tomorrow will show more." He did not know what dangers waited for him, but he knew he could not turn back. Not now. The breaking point the third day began with silence. The city was waking slowly, but Keanu sat still, watching the sky turn from gray to blue. His body was sore, his throat dry, his mind heavy. The disguise no longer felt like a costume. It felt real. Every ache in his back, every sting of cold in his fingers, every empty growl of his stomach, it all made him wonder how anyone survived this life for months or years. He thought of Frank, the man who had once been a teacher. He thought of the boy who had waved at him with innocent kindness, and he thought of the officers who had treated him like dirt. His heart was torn between hope and despair, but he knew he had to keep going. This was the only way to see the truth. He walked toward the busier part of the city, where the streets were crowded with office workers rushing to their jobs. He dragged his feet slowly, holding his paper bag as if it were his only treasure. People brushed past him without a glance. Some pulled away, as if his presence was a disease. He lowered his voice and whispered to one man, "Sir, could you spare a little change? Just for food." The man snapped back angrily, "Get a job," and stormed off. The words cut deep. He had a job, more than a job. He was a star. But in this disguise, none of that mattered. The world saw only what it wanted to see. Later that morning, Keanu found himself near a grocery store. He sat outside, leaning against the wall, when a store worker came out. The worker frowned and said, "You can't sit here. You're scaring customers." Keanu raised his hands gently. "I'll move soon, I promise." But the worker didn't listen. He called for security. Within minutes, 2 guards appeared. One of them pointed at Keanu and barked, "Get out now!" Keanu stood up slowly, keeping his voice calm. "I'm leaving," he said. But the guard shoved him anyway, hard enough that he stumbled. People passing by stopped and stared. Some whispered, but no one spoke out. Keanu felt humiliation burn inside him. It wasn't the push that hurt. It was the silence of the crowd. Silence was worse than cruelty, because it meant people had chosen not to care. As he wandered away, his stomach twisted with hunger. He hadn't eaten since the small sandwich from the boy's mother the day before. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the few dollars the kind officer had given him. He walked into a small diner, the smell of fresh food hitting him like a wave. He sat down at the counter and asked softly, "Can I have something small? Maybe just a cup of soup." The waiter looked him up and down with disdain. "We don't serve people like you. Take your business elsewhere." Keanu froze. He had money. Real money. But his appearance erased that. He stood up quietly and walked out, the sound of laughter from a nearby table following him like an echo. Outside, he sat on the curb, his body shaking. For the first time, he felt close to breaking. The weight of rejection was heavy. And he knew many others lived with this weight every single day. But the breaking point also brought something unexpected. As he sat on the curb, head in his hands, a small shadow fell across him. He looked up to see a young man, maybe in his 20s, holding a brown paper bag. "Hey, you look hungry," the young man said softly. He placed the bag beside Keanu. Inside was a sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. Keanu looked at him with wide eyes. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. The young man shrugged. "Because I can, and because no one else is." With that, he walked away. Keanu sat there, staring at the bag, his heart pounding with gratitude. In the darkest moment, a stranger had offered light. It was a reminder that kindness was not gone. It was just harder to find. That night, Keanu returned to the park. Frank was there, along with a few others. They sat together, sharing stories, sharing silence. Keanu listened as one woman spoke about how she had once been a nurse, how she had saved lives in a hospital, and now she couldn't even save herself. Her voice cracked as she said, "Out here, people don't see us as human anymore." Keanu wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that she still mattered, but his throat tightened and he could only nod. He realized that sometimes listening was more powerful than words. Later, when the others drifted to sleep, Keanu stayed awake, staring at the stars through the gaps in the clouds. He thought about his life, about the comfort he had, the fame, the wealth. And he thought about the people lying around him, shivering under thin blankets, forgotten by the world. He felt guilt rise in his chest, but also determination. This disguise was no longer just an experiment. It was becoming a mission. He wanted to use what he was learning to open people's eyes. But first, he had to endure the full weight of the streets. Only then would his message carry truth. The night grew colder, and he pulled his hood tighter around his face. He whispered to himself, "Tomorrow will bring something harder. I can feel it. But I will not turn back." The cruelest night, the 4th day, began darker than the others. Clouds hung low in the sky, heavy and gray, and the air carried the smell of rain. Keanu woke on the cold concrete, his body stiff and his mind heavy with exhaustion. Every night on the street drained him more than the one before. He was beginning to understand why so many people living like this lost hope so quickly. The constant hunger, the cold, the feeling of being invisible. It wore a person down until even breathing felt like a struggle. But Keanu forced himself to stand. He reminded himself why he was here. He was not doing this for himself. He was doing it for those who had no voice. He walked slowly through the city, his disguise still holding. People glanced at him with the same mix of disgust and indifference as before. He whispered softly to strangers, asking for help, but most ignored him. Some shook their heads without even looking. By midday, his stomach ached with hunger again. He remembered the young man from the day before who had given him food, and for a moment, he wondered if kindness was just a rare accident in a world that had forgotten compassion. That afternoon, Keanu saw something that shook him deeply. Across the street, 2 police officers were speaking harshly to a man who looked even weaker than he did. The man's hands trembled as he tried to explain himself, but one of the officers shoved him against a wall. The man cried out in pain. People passed by, some slowing for a moment, but no one stopped to intervene. Keanu's chest tightened. He wanted to step in, to reveal who he really was, but he held himself back. This was exactly what he had come to witness. The raw, painful truth of how the most vulnerable were treated. His hands clenched into fists, but he stayed silent, his heart breaking with every cruel word he heard. As evening came, the city grew colder. Keanu made his way back to the park, hoping to find Frank or the others, but the space was empty. The benches were wet with rain, and the air felt heavy with loneliness. He sat under a tree, pulling his hood tight, when a group of young men walked past. They were laughing loudly, carrying bags from a liquor store. One of them noticed Keanu and stopped. "Look at this guy," he sneered. "Bet he hasn't showered in months." The others laughed, and before Keanu could move, one of them kicked his paper bag, spilling the contents onto the wet ground. Another one shouted, "Get a job, loser!" and threw his drink in Keanu's direction. The cold liquid splashed across his chest, soaking through his thin clothes. They walked away laughing, their voices fading into the night. Keanu sat frozen, his body trembling, not from the cold, but from the cruelty. He felt humiliated, powerless. In that moment, he tasted the raw bitterness of what so many endure every day, mocked, abused, and left with nothing. He almost broke then. His heart felt too heavy, his spirit too weak. For the first time since starting this journey, he thought about ending it. He could reveal himself, pull off the disguise, walk away from the pain. But as he sat there, wet and shivering, he heard footsteps approaching. A soft voice spoke. "Are you all right, sir?" Keanu looked up to see a woman holding an umbrella. She bent down and gently picked up his soaked paper bag, placing it back in his hands. "Don't let them break you," she whispered. She pulled a scarf from her own neck and wrapped it around his shoulders before walking away into the rain. Keanu stared after her, his chest tight, his eyes burning. One act of cruelty had nearly crushed him, but one act of kindness had lifted him again. He realized then that kindness and cruelty existed side by side in this world, and which one a person chose defined who they truly were. Later that night, as the rain poured harder, Keanu found shelter under a bridge. There he discovered a small group of homeless men huddled together, sharing a fire made from scraps of wood. They welcomed him without question. One man handed him a cup of weak coffee, the steam rising into the cold air. Another offered him a piece of stale bread. They had almost nothing, yet they shared it without hesitation. Keanu sat with them, listening to their stories. One had been a soldier, another a factory worker, another a musician. Each had lost something, health, work, family, until the streets became their only home. "The world thinks we're invisible," one man said quietly, staring into the fire. But we see each other. We survive together. Keanu nodded slowly. He realized that even in the darkest corners, humanity could still be found. As the night stretched on, Keanu lay awake listening to the rain against the bridge. He thought about the cruelty of the young men, the harshness of the police, the silence of strangers. But he also thought about the woman with the umbrella, the boy who waved, the young man who gave him food, and Frank who had shared his story. The world was not simply cruel or kind, it was both. And maybe the real test was to see which side people chose when faced with someone in need. Keanu closed his eyes, shivering under the scarf that still carried the warmth of a stranger's kindness. He whispered to himself, "I will not stop. Tomorrow will test me even more. But I will not stop." The line is crossed. The fifth day began with a heavy silence. Keanu woke under the bridge where he had shared the night with the small group of homeless men. The fire had gone out, leaving only gray ash and the faint smell of smoke. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet, and his clothes clung to his body, cold and damp. His stomach ached from hunger, his muscles stiff from another night without rest. Every part of him felt weak, but his spirit forced him to stand. He reminded himself that he could leave any time, but the people around him could not. This was their life, day after day, without escape. The thought gave him strength, even as his body begged him to stop. As he walked toward the city streets, he passed an alley where two officers were questioning a homeless man. The man's hands shook as he explained that he had nowhere else to go. One officer shouted at him, accusing him of loitering. The other officer pulled his arm roughly and threatened to arrest him. Keanu froze, his heart pounding. He wanted to shout, to reveal who he really was, but he stayed silent, watching. The man finally broke down and cried, his voice trembling. "I'm just tired," he whispered. The officers laughed and shoved him aside. Keanu felt his chest tighten with anger. In that moment, he realized how easy it was for power to crush dignity, and how hard it was for someone with nothing to fight back. Later that morning, Keanu decided to test the limits of his disguise. He walked into a busy plaza where businessmen in suits hurried past, carrying briefcases and talking on phones. He sat down near the fountain, holding out his hand. "Please," he said softly, "just a little help." Most ignored him, but one man in a sharp suit stopped. He bent down and sneered, his voice filled with contempt. "You people are parasites. The world would be better without you." He spat on the ground beside Keanu and walked away. Keanu sat frozen, his hands trembling. The words cut deeper than any wound. He wanted to scream, to tell the man who he really was, but he didn't. Instead, he bowed his head, feeling the full weight of humiliation. It was a pain no amount of fame or wealth could shield him from. But just when the cruelty felt too heavy, kindness appeared again. A young girl, maybe 12, walked up with her mother. She placed a small packet of crackers in his hand and smiled shyly. Her mother whispered, "We don't have much, but I hope this helps." Keanu felt his throat tighten. He whispered, "Thank you," his voice breaking. In that moment, he realized something powerful. The smallest act of kindness could heal wounds that cruelty left behind. The crackers were simple, but to him, they felt like gold. As the day turned into night, Keanu wandered back to the park. He found Frank sitting alone on a bench, his head low. Keanu sat beside him. "Rough day?" Frank asked. Keanu nodded. Frank sighed. "It never gets easier. People think we're less than human, but we're not. We just lost our way." Keanu looked at him, his heart heavy. "Why don't people see that?" he asked softly. Frank shrugged. "Because it's easier to judge than to understand." Their conversation was cut short when two police officers entered the park. One of them was the same officer who had shoved Keanu earlier. His eyes locked on Keanu, sharp and cold. "You again?" he said harshly. "I told you not to sit around here." Keanu lowered his head. "I'm not hurting anyone, sir," he said quietly. The officer stepped closer, his voice sharp. "Are you talking back?" Before Keanu could respond, the officer shoved him hard in the chest. Keanu stumbled and fell against the bench. Frank shouted, "Leave him alone!" But the officer barked, "Stay out of this, old man!" The other officer watched silently, his face tense but unwilling to intervene. The shove was stronger than before, and Keanu felt a sharp pain in his side. He winced, but stayed quiet. He wanted to see how far this would go, how much power would be used against someone with no defense. The officer reached for his baton, his voice rising. "You want to spend the night in jail? Because I can make that happen." Keanu's heart raced. He knew he could end it all by revealing himself, but he stayed silent. He wanted the truth, even if it broke him. Frank grabbed his arm and whispered, "Don't fight. It'll only make it worse." Keanu nodded slowly, swallowing his pride, swallowing his anger. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. The officers finally walked away, leaving Keanu shaken and bruised. Frank placed a hand on his shoulder. "They broke you down because they could," he said softly. Keanu felt tears sting his eyes, not for himself but for everyone who had to live this reality every single day. He realized that the streets weren't just about hunger and cold. They were about constant battles for dignity, battles that most people lost before they even began. That night, under the dark sky, Keanu lay on the ground with Frank beside him. He stared up at the stars, his body aching, his mind heavy. He whispered to himself, "Tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow, I will push further. I need to see how far this world will go. Only then can I show it the truth." The truth revealed the sixth day began with a strange stillness. The air was cold, the streets quiet, as if the city itself was waiting for something to happen. Keanu sat alone on the curb, his body weak, his spirit bruised, yet his determination stronger than ever. The days on the street had changed him. He no longer felt like a man wearing a disguise. He felt like he had become one with the people who lived this reality. Every ache, every rejection, every cruel word, he carried it now as if it belonged to him. And in his heart, he knew that what he had witnessed could not stay hidden. It had to be shown. He walked slowly toward the same plaza where he had been mocked the day before. People rushed past, their eyes fixed on their own lives, ignoring him. But today, something different was about to unfold. As he sat quietly, the same officer who had shoved him in the park the night before appeared with his partner. His eyes narrowed as he recognized Keanu's face beneath the hood. "You again," the officer growled. "How many times do I have to tell you to move?" Keanu kept his voice calm. "I'm not hurting anyone, sir. I'm just sitting." The officer stepped closer, his hand resting on his baton. "You think you can talk back to me? Stand up. Now!" Keanu stood slowly, his heart pounding. A small crowd began to gather, curious to see what was happening. Frank, who had followed behind him, whispered urgently, "Don't fight him, please." The officer shoved Keanu hard in the chest, sending him stumbling back. Gasps rose from the crowd. The officer raised his baton, his voice sharp. "I told you!" But before he could strike, Keanu lifted his head, pulled back his hood, and spoke loudly for everyone to hear. "My name is Keanu Reeves." The world seemed to freeze. The officer's arm hung in the air, his face pale. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some people stepped closer, whispering in shock. Cameras from bystanders' phones rose quickly into the air, recording everything. Frank's eyes widened, his mouth falling open. Keanu's voice shook, not with fear, but with emotion. For 6 days I have walked these streets disguised as a homeless man. I have been ignored. I have been shoved. I have been mocked. I have been treated as if I were less than human. But I have also seen kindness. A boy who gave me food. A woman who shared her scarf. Strangers who shared the little they had. He paused, his eyes wet with tears. This is what our city looks like when we strip away the fame, the money, the titles. This is what so many live through every single day. The officer lowered his baton slowly, his face red with shame. Keanu turned to the crowd, his voice strong now. I wanted to see the truth. I wanted to see how we treat those who have nothing. And the truth is hard. The truth is cruel. But it is also full of light, because even in the darkest places, there are people who choose kindness. And that is what we must hold on to. The crowd stood in silence, many with their phones still recording, others with tears in their eyes. Keanu placed his hand on Frank's shoulder. This man was a teacher. Others here were workers, soldiers, nurses, fathers, mothers. They are not invisible. They are not worthless. They are us. A woman in the crowd stepped forward and handed Frank a bottle of water. Another man took off his jacket and placed it gently over the shoulders of another homeless man nearby. Slowly, almost like a ripple across the water, people began to respond. Food was shared. Blankets were offered. Respect was given. The officer who had been cruel looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The younger officer, the one who had shown kindness days earlier, stepped forward. He looked at Keanu and said softly, "Thank you for showing us what we forget to see." Keanu nodded. His voice broke as he said, "No one deserves to be treated as less. No one deserves to be forgotten. If you take one thing from this, let it be this. Respect costs nothing, but it can mean everything." That night, news spread across the world. Videos of Keanu revealing himself flooded the internet. Headlines carried the story of how one of the most beloved actors had disguised himself as a homeless man to test the system. People everywhere began to talk, not just about Keanu, but about the countless lives that were ignored every day. Donations increased, shelters received support, and hearts that had been closed began to open. But for Keanu, the lesson was personal. As he walked away from the plaza, still wearing the scarf the woman had given him, he felt humbled. The streets had stripped him down to his core and shown him something he would never forget. That true strength is not in power, but in compassion. That respect is the foundation of humanity. That even when the world is cruel, kindness can still rise like light through the cracks. He knew his life would never be the same. And he knew he would carry the voices of the people he had met. The teacher, the soldier, the nurse, the boy, the young man, the woman with the umbrella, forever in his heart. And so the test ended. But the mission began. Keanu promised himself he would not stop speaking, not stop helping, not stop reminding the world of what he had seen. Because sometimes, to change the world, you must first walk through its shadows.